Here on the program, non-profit organisation Corruption Watch has released its annual report focusing on different levels of corruption in South Africa. The report's findings show an increase in corruption in both the police and health sectors. The organisation applauds the 1,590 brave whistleblowers who have exposed corruption in different sectors across the country. Mzwandile Banjathwa, campaigns coordinator at Corruption Watch, is here to discuss this further. Good to see you. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you very much, Moni.
So, looking at this year's report on corruption in South Africa, let's talk to some of the highlights that have come out of this.
I think one of the biggest highlights is, of course, the rise in the number of reports that we have been receiving from various sectors, specifically the SABC, the Department of Health, municipalities, schools as well, trafficking and license as well.
Yeah, so you've seen an increase, which is a good sign, no doubt, that people are reporting more. They're talking out about corruption.
It is a good sign that you're having more people reporting this,
yeah.
But it is also a bad
it's
indication.
A bad sign.
Because
that goes without saying, is the fact that we're seeing
yeah.
more and more. But the fact that people are speaking out, I suppose, is the one aspect and the positivity that we can look at it. So now that you've got these reports, let's talk to the findings and the talk that police are the most corrupt public servants. That's a rather frightening finding.
I think this is quite consistent with the Afrobarometer that was released slightly earlier on, which says that in South Africa particularly, on the survey that was conducted, one of the most of the people who were surveyed were saying that the police is one of the highly corrupt institutions. Some of them went on to say that if not some of them, all of them are corrupt. So that's quite frightening. And consequential to that, our analysis to corruption trend also is consistent with the Afrobarometer, because we find that there is an increase in the number of people reporting corruption in the SABC as well.
What kind of misdeeds are being reported? What are people saying?
People are reporting incidences, particularly of bribery. Bribery is on the rise with 31%, and there's 21% of irregularities in procurement process. But what is also troubling is that there are irregularities in the employment processes as well. And you would know that in one of the parliamentary seatings, the Minister of Police also cited that they have a challenge of about, I think, around 4,000 plus police officers who have criminal records. So that is quite a frightening thing as well, coupled with the irregularities in employment processes. But what we are receiving, and this is what the people are telling us, and in our community engagement, this is what we are finding, that corruption, more especially within the SABC, disproportionately affects women. Because in most cases, as we heard in the Western Cape, particularly in Cape Town when we went there, is that women are sexually harassed, and in some instances they are sexually assaulted by the very same police officers who are supposed to protect them. We also find that in the annual report of IPID, about 112 reports were reported against police officers, and these are cases of alleging rape as well. So, and some of them are in police custody. So this is quite frightening and quite disturbing. Last week alone, we have received a report that was talking about police officers targeting foreign nationals in particular. Yeah. So they picked up the reporter. They then drove around with him. They wanted a 2,000 bribe. He didn't have that amount of money with him, so they drove around with him from 9 until 2. Fortunately, we were able to get the registration number of the car, so we did a follow-up on that. But what he told us is that upon his release, they quickly apprehended 2 more foreign nationals whom they took to the nearest ATM, and they compelled them to make a withdrawal of an unknown amount.
Yeah, you know, this is really frightening, and it's not anything new. We know about corruption within the police force, or allegations of corruption in the police force. The fact that this has now become according to Corruption Watch, the most corrupt sector when it comes to public service sectors. This, I think, is the most worrying part of the entire thing. But what happens? I mean, you guys do this research, you talk to it, we see the results coming out, we hear the stories, and yet, does it ever get used for good? Do we see anything coming of it?
I think there might be at times movement, and there are times there might be holes to those movements. There's a newly established internal anti-corruption unit within the SAPS, which we have been engaging with in a couple of times. We have taken a couple of reports that we have received from the public to them. So they are still investigating some of those issues. So in engaging with the public also, we have tried to bring in the police secretariat to come and talk about the work that they do, because in most cases we find that little is known about the police secretariat and the work that they also do. But people now, and equally with us as an organization, we want to start seeing more action from the police, because this is now becoming a huge frustration, where there are investigations done, but there aren't any prosecutions that we are seeing. Even disciplinary hearings are quite a problem as well, because in some cases you find that there's an investigation that is done, now a disciplinary hearing is undertaken, but the disciplinary action will then be undermined. So you can't then charge the police officer again, because now it's double jeopardy and you can't do that.
I mean, we look at what's happening in the Western Cape, for instance, in Cape Town, the high murder rate, and a lot of the issues have been attributed to the corruption within the police forces, that they are in with the gangsters, they are being bribed, they are privy to the corruption that's happening, and we are seeing hundreds of people dying. I mean, just at a rate that we've never seen before in these areas, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. Do you get reports that are coming out of, let's just take Cape Town, for instance?
Not only do we get reports from Cape Town, we had actually went down to Cape Town, I think twice, one this year, and we also went back last year as well. So we spoke to some of the whistleblowers who are finding it quite problematic, because one, they are not protected, and secondly, their lives now are in danger, and some of them are in hiding. So this is a huge problem. But over and above that, what we are beginning to get, which is quite troubling, is that there are police officers who are in the pockets of these criminals, and they are the ones who then undermine investigations. They are the ones who also talk or tell these criminal syndicates about who had reported and where do they stay and all of those things. So they divulge information about whistleblowers, which is quite troubling.
Yeah. So, all right, let's move off the police for now, because this is an issue we're going to pick up again with the police themselves, just to get their reaction to it. Schools have always come out as number one in terms of corruption. I'm happy to see that they have dropped down. Do you think that this is a good indication, or is it just that people are not necessarily reporting what's happening with regard to corruption in schools?
People continue to report incidences of corruption in schools, but yes, we have noticed that there hasn't been a huge increase, and part to that, I think it's maybe because we have been doing a lot of community engagements, more especially doing capacity training with SGB members to actually tell them about their rights and their responsibilities, because in the reports that we have received and in analysis that we have made, we've been able to see that the problem is that the SGB members in most cases do not know their rights and responsibilities, and in times principals tend to take advantage of that. And in the reports that we have received, most of the culprits are some of the members of the SGB and also principals. And what's quite disturbing is that the school's nutrition program has been taken advantage of. This is one of the critical things that we are finding. We find that sometimes teachers or school principals would buy meals from from a store, for example, and then once all of those, once all of the papers and paperwork have been done for, they will then take it back in exchange for cash. So that's one of the troubling factors that we are also receiving. And also procurement irregularities within schools is also another problem that we are beginning to have, the inflation of prices and so forth.
And that's frightening. I mean, as you say, coming from the heads of these schools, the headmasters, the school governing bodies, the teachers, and this is the corruption that's taking place, and it's not reaching the children who need this. I mean, especially when you talk about these feeding schemes. I mean, that's, you know, it's perhaps the only meal that some of these kids get a day, and they're not receiving it.
That's true. But some of the kids are excluded from education because they are made to pay in no-fee schools. So that's another problem.
It's even worse.
Yeah.
All right. Also, the health sector. This is coming up quite prominently when it comes to whistleblowers talking about what's happening at the health sector. Just quickly talk to us about this as well.
So in the health sector, procurement is one of the biggest problem, as we would know, that government procures a lot more, especially for the Department of Health, and we find that there's a lot of corruption happening there. There is irregularities in employment processes as well within the health sector, which is quite troubling, given that we don't have enough expertise that we might need, and we can't even attract as much as we have, as much as we can. There's a huge shortage of nurses, doctors, and so forth. But you find that there are no statistic appointments that are then made within the Department of Health, which is quite troubling as well.
Yeah, and the health sector, I mean, is something of a major concern. If it stands right now as being the second most corrupt after the police, according to Corruption Watch, what's going to happen when NHI comes along? And that, I imagine, Corruption Watch have got their views on. What do you think about NHI in the background of what's already happening in the health sector?
Well, so I think the NHI, I suppose, initially would come with good intentions, but unfortunately there's a lot that needs to be worked around. Issues of corruption, for one, is a huge problem. Issues of expertise and skills that are needed is another. Issues of infrastructure, we need to build more infrastructure and so forth. So given the current state and probably the way in which it is proposed, maybe it might pose a bit of problem. It might need a little bit of reworking there and there, but yeah, I think that would be what I would say.
Yeah. Finally, the whistleblowers that you have highlighted, and I think we're talking about 1,591 roundabout there. Yep. You still say that there just isn't enough protection from government with regard to these whistleblowers, that, you know, they're scared to come forward because they are not protected, they're not looked after. You know, what is the current status on laws protecting whistleblowers?
I think the law that we currently have now would be the Protected Disclosures Act, and we know that it has been amended, I think, around 2017 or so. The problem now becomes that it only focuses on the employer-employee relationship and covers that space. But we are getting reports from people who are not employed, who are not covered. So we think it should be far-reaching and not only focus on that niche of employer-employee relationship. But of course you would appreciate that it has been expanded on. For example, it now covers employees who are working on contract basis, like your consultants and so forth. It also covers employees who are employed by third parties, like labor brokers, for instance. But it does not necessarily cover volunteers. So we think it should also be expanded to volunteers as well. But we need to also give credit to our whistleblowers. I mean, these are people who use their freedom of expression to expose and challenge the abuse of power that undermines public trust. So we should at all times give credit to them, because they are the ones who allow us to continue doing the work that we do and also expose the corruption that we now see. I mean, if it wasn't for whistleblowers, we wouldn't have the commissions that we're having right now. So, yeah.
Indeed. Thank you for talking to us here on the program. Mzwandile Banjathwa is a campaigns coordinator at Corruption Watch, discussing the latest findings on corruption at different sectors in the country, with findings showing an increase in the police and health sectors. All right, let's take a break. We'll see you with newspapers after this. Stay tuned.